Hi, welcome to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. It's Wednesday, March 5th, and I'm Jessica Steinberg. I'm speaking today with U.S. Bureau Chief Jacob Magid. Hey, Jacob.
Hey, Jessica. Good to be with you again.
Glad we are here together today. It is day 516 of the war. This morning, Ohad Yahalomi, whose body was released from captivity in Gaza, will be buried in the cemetery of his community, kibbutz near Oz. Several freed hostages attended U.S. President Donald Trump's State of the Union address Tuesday. We'll talk about some of what the president said in his speech to Congress. We'll also discuss Jacob's interview with a top Qatari official regarding the hostage deal, the Arab leaders' plan for Gaza, frustration with the Palestinian Authority's Mahmoud Abbas, and some more details regarding the Palestinian prisoner payment reform. All of that after a quick break. Okay, Jacob, let's start with the most recent news, State of the Union address. There were some recently freed hostages in the audience, and President Trump did make reference to the hostages and the hostage deal. I know you were waiting to see what he would say. Give us a little bit of a sense of what you were hearing there.
Yeah, waited and waited and waited. It was an hour and 40-minute long speech. So that's the record-setting longest one ever given by a U.S. president to a joint session of Congress. There had been a lot of, I guess you could say, anticipation in Israel that there would be a strong and long reference to the issue of the hostages, given that there were several invited by the president to attend the ceremony. Other lawmakers invited former hostages and their family members to attend as their special guests. And as you mentioned, several in the audience. I saw Noah Argamani was one of them, and Yair Horn is another, two recently released hostages.
And Keith Siegel, no?
I didn't see him in the gallery. He is in Washington. There's a delegation of, I think, about 7 hostages, who among them are Keith and Aviva Siegel, that will be meeting with Trump officials. If you remember, Sharon Sharabi, who is Eli Sharabi's brother, the former hostage who gave this very a moving and jarring interview last week on Israeli television regarding the conditions of his captivity. Footage from that interview was translated and shown to Trump, who, we are told by Sharon, invited Eli to meet with the president this week. So he's also part of this delegation. The Hostage Families Forum specifically said they're going to be meeting this delegation with Trump officials. So it's unclear whether there's actually going to be a meeting with the president. It was supposed to be held, according to one report, on Tuesday, but I don't think that took place yet. So we'll have to see. But again, there was anticipation that they would maybe get a shout out from Trump during the speech. That's something that he did for quite a few people, including Mark Fogel, a released hostage from that was held in Russia. That Steve Witkoff was instrumental in bringing about his freedom. But that didn't happen in the case of the Gaza hostages, where Trump summed it up as, in the Middle East, we are bringing back our hostages from Gaza. And that was the end of the issue in the speech that he gave. That was the end of the issue in the speech. So there was no personal shout out. We didn't really see footage of them as a result. But I do believe that there was a bunch of them in the audience. So I think that was a little bit of a surprise. If you want to read into it, you could suggest that there's not a lot of maybe expectation in the Trump administration that this deal is going to hold. The U.S. has been backing Israel, the Israeli government, in its move to rework the deal that Israel had committed to, and is now trying to get this Ramadan ceasefire that extends through Passover, claiming it's a Witkoff proposal. Witkoff himself has not commented on it, and the U.S. has avoided also saying it's really done by the U.S. But basically, the U.S. and Israel are in lockstep about whatever Israel decides it wants to do. The U.S. is going to back it, and that's what Trump's approach has been for the past several weeks as he's gotten more frustrated with Hamas, and that means abandoning the framework of Phase 2 that he himself had helped finalize, given that the Phase 2 it offers the remaining living hostages in exchange for an end to the war, which Israel's not willing to do right now. So as a result, maybe you could say that he wasn't really willing to put too much emphasis on this issue, when also just it was a speech largely focused on domestic policy. He mentioned briefly the Abraham Accords and his desire to expand them, but that's going to be difficult if they return to the war. Saudi Arabia has made clear that it's moving in a different direction given its frustrations with this Israeli government.
So, Jacob, speaking of the hostage proposal, given that you just returned from Qatar where you interviewed a senior official, talk to us about what they are saying in Qatar about the hostage proposal. In your piece, it seems to be that they were urging to stick to the existing framework, not to, extend the current hostage deal, really just to stick to the one that was agreed upon, as you just mentioned, with the phase two. So tell us some of what you were hearing in this interview.
I spoke with Magid al-Ansari, who is the spokesperson for the foreign ministry and also a senior aide to the prime minister of Qatar. And this was an interesting comment that I chose to headline, I thought, because until now, Qatar has been very careful not to criticize the Trump administration. It's been one of the only Arab countries, despite actually being, you could say, more hawkish on the Palestinian issue in some ways, that it didn't criticize Trump for his Gaza takeover plan. If you look at Egypt and Jordan and Saudi Arabia, the PA, all of them were very critical of it. Qatar avoided doing so. And yet, Magid in this interview made a point of saying we need to stick to the current deal. Didn't explicitly say we oppose this new idea, but just basically said that it won't likely work. Hamas has made it clear that it's willing to release the hostages in the framework that Israel agreed to, and not willing to accept a new proposal that Israel's trying to push right now. It's not going to release hostages, definitely en masse, unless it has guarantees that there will be an end to the war. I think that's what it's most interested in right now. It's its survival, and that's the feeling in Qatar and Egypt, the two mediating countries, that we're not going to get a better opportunity to release hostages under a different framework. And it's interesting that they're willing to say publicly that the one, if it's a Trump proposal, Witkoff proposal, or just an Israeli proposal, whoever's behind it, it's not going to work, according to Magid al-Ansari. And I think that was one thing I chose to note in the piece. He also highlights Qatar's slightly different position regarding Hamas compared to other Arab partners. That while it's hosted Hamas at the request of the U.S. and Israel for a long time now, but it also is saying that while the U.S. wants Hamas to be completely out of the picture after the war, and Israel feels obviously the same way, that decision is one for the Palestinians to make, and it's not going to be something that Qatar dictates to the parties, which obviously is not something that I think the U.S. wants to hear either, and is likely going to be a point of contention moving forward.
What was the tone of your conversation, just in terms of, it's an interview, of course, but I'm just curious about it since you were able to get this unusual interview. In other words, it's not usually granted to Israeli media. So I'm just curious about the tone of it in that sense.
Yeah, I think Qatar's in this interesting position where they don't have official ties with Israel, but they do, at the same time, basically have more regular relationships with Israeli officials because of their hosting of Hamas and playing this mediating role than actually countries that do have ties. So it's a very unique position, and they have given a couple interviews with Israeli press over the past year, trying to use that as a way to reach the Israeli public and try to sway it, as a lot of the animosity towards Qatar escalates. Even just in the hours before we were supposed to have this interview, had a pretty big Channel 12 report giving new allegations regarding Qatar's ties to Hamas, all sorts of allegations, including that Qatar paid for cameras that were used by a Hamas militant wing to track Israeli soldiers, was probably the most damning allegation. It was unsourced largely, so it's hard to confirm, but I did ask this Qatari official about it, and he said that there's nothing behind it. The only aid we gave to Gaza is the humanitarian aid, and it was requested and monitored by Israel. So again, kind of just dismissing these allegations and saying that they're part of this campaign to harm Qatar's image.
Interesting stuff. All right, let's take a quick break. When we're back, we'll talk about really what are the ongoing conversations about plans for the Gaza Strip and the different countries that are taking part in that conversation. So stay with us. Okay. So you've got a few pieces that really relate to what will happen with the Gaza Strip after the war is over. Why don't we start with the Arab states meeting about post-war Gaza reconstruction? There's a mention here about that they're losing patience with Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas in this process. But take us through that and let's see where it brings us at the end of that piece of the conversation.
Sure. So on Tuesday, a much anticipated summit was held in Cairo, where the Arab countries, Arab allies of the United States, many of them also allies of Israel, at least technically, are trying to come up and present an alternative vision to the one presented by President Trump a few weeks ago at the White House. This concept of taking over Gaza, completely relocating all of its roughly 2 million Palestinians. That is not something that was very welcomed in the Arab world. And I think the way that the Trump administration has tried to explain it in hindsight is that even if it's not something that we're going to adapt or to adopt, it is something that we want to shake up the Arab opinion and push them to come up with their own solution to the Gaza problem that is realistic and one that also pushes Hamas aside. Because there's no longer any, except I don't think there was before, even under the Biden administration, they said that Hamas can't be a part of the future of Gaza. And I think that's something that generally the Arab states also support, but aren't convinced that it's really feasible given the strength of Hamas and able to withstand 15 months of war. But now I think there's further pressure to not accept that possibility. So this plan that Egypt is leading in presenting basically offers to have this committee of technocrats that will rule Gaza, manage Gaza for a 6-month interim period before the strip is then handed over to the Palestinian Authority. So in neither of these cases, there's no Hamas involved in running Gaza. But the word Hamas doesn't get any mention in this over 100-page document that I obtained, which is the Egyptian proposal. Instead, the one mention is talking about how armed groups are a real problem, but they can only be addressed through a two-state solution and a framework towards getting there. This is something that Arab diplomats had told me, I think, for quite some time in the weeks leading up to this proposal, that we can push Hamas aside from the governance of Gaza, but trying to get them to turn in their weapons is just something that's not going to happen. Maybe if we get a political process like what is mentioned in this document, but absent that, and even if in that scenario it's going to be gradual, and that's what I guess they're putting forward. And the other key elements that I'll just mention are this $53 billion in aid that they say will be required for the reconstruction. How they're going to get it exactly is not clear, but I guess some of them will be contributing. I'm sure Saudi Arabia will be among those countries. But it's going to be an international effort. They're hoping to get a UN Security Council resolution that will mandate a peacekeeping force in Gaza as well. Egypt and Jordan will train Palestinian Authority police officers in order to boost the security of Gaza during the interim period. And then Gaza will be divided into 7 different zones, and each zone will be prepared and rebuilt on its own in order to allow Gazans to remain in Gaza as opposed to having them all move out during the period of reconstruction. So this is the proposal, not really too welcomed by the United States, which quickly issues a statement saying it doesn't accept this, that Hamas can't be part of Hamas needs to be completely dismantled. And I think they wanted more clarity regarding the Hamas issue than the Arab states gave. And it's kind of surprising, honestly, that, or maybe maybe not depending on who you ask, but to me, if this was something that the U.S. was talking about all the time, about why and how the Arab states knew it was under a lot of pressure to get this deal that has some chances of succeeding, and to not mention it at all is surprising. I guess it just reflects the realities how they see it. But possibly I think there still will be efforts maybe behind the scenes. I think maybe they didn't want to publicly address the issue too much, and get maybe work quietly to push Hamas aside. But this wasn't enough to get the approval of the U.S., which said that it still stands with Trump's approach to, I guess, clear out Gaza and remove all Palestinians. So I guess the U.S. does mention that the talks will continue with its allies on this issue. So maybe there's still room for negotiation and compromise. But right now, I think the sides are on pretty separate roads right now.
And then you have a piece about the fact that the Arab states are losing patience with Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas. And of course, they're a very significant element in this whole puzzle, but there's this piece of it as well. So give us a sense of what we're really talking about here. In other words, the Palestinian Authority is needed in this picture, but it's not like they're a very desirable partner to the Arab states. Would you say that's true?
Yeah, I guess they're stuck with the PA, and they're all in agreement that the PA should be the party that rules Gaza in the day after. But they all also agree that it needs to undergo reform. I think some countries are more frustrated with Abu Mazen than others. But it was highlighted that it's becoming an increasingly consensus frustration, in a preparatory meeting that was held in Riyadh, about a few days before this meeting in Cairo, where the main item on the agenda was preparing for the Cairo summit and discussing the Gaza issue. And who was not even invited was Abu Mazen Mahmoud Abbas. I think it highlights just, again, a lot of frustration. It's not just the UAE anymore. It's also Qatar, who's frustrated with him because of the legislation he's taken, or the steps he's taken to push the Al Jazeera out of the West Bank. There's the Egypt, who's also Sisi's rejected a meeting with him, that Abu Mazen's been seeking. And there are quite a few other countries that have similar frustration, and therefore he was left out of the meeting in Riyadh. I think is maybe a wake-up call to try to get him to be more flexible. I think Egypt wants the PA not to be specifically part of the technocrat committee. Abu Mazen wants to appoint a deputy prime minister to be in charge of the committee. So I think Egypt is trying to say, look, we need to just work with technocrats now to not give Hamas an excuse to play spoiler. And that has not been accepted by the PA, but maybe now, after I think they left him out of the equation, maybe they'll be more willing to accept Egypt's Gaza proposal. But there's clearly a push for Abu Mazen to if not change, just at least not be an obstacle. And that is what I tried to highlight a little bit in this piece from a few days ago. What I thought was interesting, also speaking with a senior European diplomat in Ramallah, was he made the point as, yes, Abu Mazen needs to adapt and reform, but he thought that there's a little bit of unfair criticism lodged at Abu Mazen because he's being pulled in multiple directions by each different country that has its own interests or view of how it wants the PA to look. And therefore, he's not going to be able to please everyone. In the reality, what's happening is he's pleasing no one. But really, this call for him to reform by a group of mostly autocratic, dictatorial leaders is kind of a little bit hypocritical, as the European official was saying, given that it's not like these countries are all bastions of democracy either. But Abu Mazen's in this position where he's very reliant on them. So I think either they're masking their concerns regarding reform, or they're masking their concerns regarding what they want the PA to look like in the concept of reform, or they're just looking for ways to sway Abu Mazen as much as they can.
Interesting. Okay. So then finally, you have another piece. Essentially, it's like the Palestinian Authority's response to all of this, so to speak, saying that the Palestinian Authority, this is a senior Palestinian official, said that the PA will cut ties with the U.S. if President Trump advances his proposal to take over the Gaza Strip and relocate all its residents, which of course is not what we've been discussing right now. In a sense, that's looking to the Arab states and to see what they can do. So tell us a little bit about that, because again, it is bringing forward this other idea that was proposed a few weeks ago that really everyone has, rejected out of hand. But what is this? Is this the PA's response to all of this, saying, hey, you want us to take charge here? This is what we think.
Yeah, it was an interesting interview I did in Ramallah last week with Ahmed Majdalani, who he's a longtime PA minister. He's also a very close confidant to Mahmoud Abbas. And he's also been put in charge of this new, or I guess it's not a new forum, but it's a forum that's outside of the government that will be running the new welfare system that will be replacing the controversial pay for slay prisoner payment system. So he's a pretty central figure, and it was good to sit down with him for quite an hour. And actually, he gave me so much to work with in this interview that I made it into two separate pieces, one on the prisoner payment reform, and then the other on this shocking, I thought, threat to cut ties with the Trump administration. Not because it's really surprising, because he's saying that we will cut ties if Trump advances with this plan to take over Gaza and displace all of its Palestinians. Of course, that would be what you would expect the PA to do. It cut ties for much less in the first term when Trump recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital and pushed forward this peace plan that envisioned Israel annexing all of its settlements in the West Bank. But for them to now give this threat, someone so close to Abu Mazen, someone so quickly into the Trump administration, I was quite surprised that they were willing to say publicly. And I wouldn't be surprised also if Michelani gets admonished for making these comments. But it was noteworthy that they're being said. And I think it shows just how much, as you mentioned, how that they completely reject this idea. And I think I encourage our readers to take a look at the piece as it comes out on Wednesday.
Just to sum that up, Jacob, though, in other words, ultimately, was he saying that they would still play a role, that they would, sort of play along with the Arab states' plan? Because given the timing of all of this, you're writing all of this in the last few days. So is that essentially what he was saying, that ultimately they don't like certain aspects of the plan that's being put out there, but that's the plan that they would play along with?
So this interview took place before the Arab plan was released. But yes, I think the PAs are not really in a position to come and say that they're only going to come into the Gaza Strip under specific conditions. They recognize that they're a much smaller player here. And I think that they will. But yes, I think they want to be the dominant player. And that was what I had another interview with Mahmoud Habash, who said that in the interview that I encourage our readers to also take a look at. That's the approach that the PA is trying to, as much as possible, play a role, recognizing that it has to reform. And that's why it took this step, I think, to reform its prisoner payment system. It is trying to make nice with the Trump administration, which is also why it's so surprising that they're willing to publicly say that they're willing to threaten, that they're willing to cut those ties. Michelani did make clear that if Trump abandons this, we're happy to continue in this rehabilitation of the ties that fell apart, that had fallen apart in the first term. But if not, we're not. Of course, we would cut ties, is what he said. I asked him 3 times to clarify if this is really what he was saying, because I was so surprised that they would want to say it publicly at this point. When he said, of course, this is where we are. And I thought that was important to headline.
Yeah. All right. We will link to all those pieces at the end of this podcast. So take a look at that. Thank you, Jacob. It's been good to hear your highlights of the last few days. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Jessica. Thanks for having me.
Sure. And thanks to all of you for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. We'll be back again tomorrow with another installment. This episode was produced by the Podwaves. Any comments you have, drop us an email, podcast@timesofisrael.com. And always feel free to recommend us to other listeners and rate us wherever you find your podcasts. Until next time, take care, be well, have yourselves a good day.